This is the third and final part of the Climate Change in West Virginia series. I highly recommend that you watch the first two parts so it's easier to understand some of the concepts being discussed. There's no doubt that climate change is a complex issue, and it can be hard to grasp. Unfortunately, one of the things being discussed within the scientific community is a lack of access to information surrounding climate change in West Virginia. Not only are there a lot of studies behind a paywall, but the conversation just isn't there.
Without a doubt, there is misinformation about climate change. There is a lot of money going into undermining the science and the credibility of scientists around climate change. That's factual. That is indeed happening. But I don't think that's the only problem we have in West Virginia around taking action. It's a really big, overwhelming, complicated issue that does not have an easy solution to it. Again, it's kind of like COVID, right? Like, we're all emotionally exhausted by the weights that this disruption has. So now take the weight of that disruption and impose that on our economically challenged families in West Virginia. Who the hell cares about climate change 10, 20, 50 years down the line when, I'm trying to put food on the table?
Climate change discussion is also absent in the capital, in Charleston.
There are bills that would help with climate change. They're not usually debated in terms of climate change, because unlike some states where there's a large constituency of people and policymakers that are committed to addressing climate change, we're not quite there yet in West Virginia. But that doesn't mean that there aren't good bills that could both grow the economy and address climate change.
Downstream Strategies is a company based in Morgantown that provides environmental and economic consulting. Evan Hansen, the president of the company, said he decided to run for House of Delegates after the 2015 water crisis in the Charleston area, when legislators invited him to help them with a bill that increased protections for drinking water. Since then, he has introduced a number of climate change-related bills, some that had passed and some that didn't.
Climate change is not talked about much in West Virginia because the economy has been tied so closely to fossil fuels over such a long time, and they've really controlled the political system. But what we've found, or what we've seen with the coal industry so far, is they're just digging in their heels and not acknowledging the science and fighting against any policy that would diversify the energy economy, even policies that are clearly good for the state and for local communities because they would create new types of jobs, pure self-interest over the public interest.
One thing that was discussed in the last episode is how climate change is indirectly costing West Virginians billions of dollars in flooding, pollution treatment, increased food costs, and other factors. But as demand for environmentally friendly options grows in other countries, states, and companies, many fear that West Virginia is going to naturally fall behind. In the latest Gallup poll, only 22% of respondents said that as a country, the United States should put more emphasis on coal. It's the lowest percentage of the energy industries that were polled, and it went down almost 10 percentage points in 6 years. In fact, all the non-renewable resources, including oil and gas, saw a sharp decline, while renewables like solar and wind increased or stayed about the same.
The cost of renewable energy production has come down dramatically just in the past 5 to 10 years. It's now outpacing, it's now cheaper to produce electricity from renewables than it is from fossil fuels. So what we're seeing, like it or not, is that market forces are driving a transition in energy. And again, we want to make sure that West Virginia is keeping pace and trying to stay ahead of that curve and not get too far behind.
A lot of companies, more and more, have renewable electricity targets where they're committed to getting a certain percentage of their power from renewables like solar. More and more companies have that commitment because as a corporation, they're committed to addressing climate change, and also because their customers demand it.
Last legislative session, West Virginia lawmakers were confronted by that problem. Laws in West Virginia made it difficult for electric companies to put electric from renewable resources into the grid.
We had the Secretary of Commerce testify under oath before the Energy Committee that one of the first questions that's often asked by companies that are considering siting in West Virginia is whether they have access to enough solar electricity to power their operations. And he's had to say no. you don't have access to enough solar in West Virginia. So those companies just say, no, we can't come to West Virginia because if we plug into the grid, we get mostly coal-based electricity and very little renewables, and that's just not acceptable anymore.
Some people were concerned that allowing solar into the grid would detract from coal and cause a decline. But the bill was passed with both Republican and Democrat support, with a limit on what percentage of electric is allowed to be solar.
There's a 90 megawatt solar farm that's being built right outside of Beckley in Raleigh County, and that would not have happened if we had not changed the rules to be more fair toward solar development.
But although wind and solar are known for their small carbon footprint, wind and solar are not perfect solutions either. For one, both can have expensive upfront costs. They also obviously both depend heavily on the weather, and so they're criticized for not being as dependable as fossil fuels, and it would be more difficult to prevent power surges or outages. Critics of wind power are concerned that the wind turbines kill a substantial amount of large and sometimes endangered birds, which could throw off the local ecosystem. Solar is criticized for taking up too much surface space, requiring these large solar farms that displace wildlife, including trees. One way to mitigate this is to put solar panels on roofs. In fact, another bill that was on the table last session had to do with power purchase agreements, where a company would install a solar panel on top of a roof at no cost to the family or business. In fact, they would get a lower electricity bill as a result. However, this bill didn't pass. And then there's discussion around how solar panels and wind turbines are made, shipped, and recycled. But at the end of the day, what does this great energy battle mean for West Virginia? If the market shifts away from coal, or legislation requires limiting carbon dioxide emissions, people are likely to suffer.
Who does pay the price? If we need to reduce emissions, that's going to cost money. Let's say we're going to continue with coal-fired power plants and require them to do more control and put more treatment on their smokestacks, let's say. That's going to cost money. And does that cost then get passed along to the consumers? Those are important questions, and how much, and how again are we not making sure we overburden people who are already struggling to keep their heat on, and that we have some safety nets and careful thinking about how we're sharing that cost.
A new buzzword in the climate change discussion is just transition, which attempts to take into account people who would be disproportionately impacted by a transition away from fossil fuels. For example, looking for alternative job solutions for coal miners or promising healthcare or scholarship to help with a transition.
So just transition is this awareness and the mandate to take action to consider the spectrum of understanding the winners and losers of any decision. And there are people that argue against that, we could never decarbonize our economy, coal is life. But at least in the just transition narrative, there's space for everybody's voice in how that transition occurs. Coal's a great example of where there are very few people that control everything around coal mining in West Virginia and in the country. They're very powerful, wealthy people that ultimately dictate winners and losers in West Virginia. That is not a democratic process. And so through this just transition framework, we have the opportunity to understand, how can everybody have a voice, but how can we consider the needs of people that have different levels of disruption associated with that.
On a national level, West Virginia's voice is one of the most important ones in a just transition discussion. But experts say because our state has turned a blind eye and little research has been done into what West Virginia needs, they're often overlooked in federal climate change legislation.
I introduced the Just Transition Bill last session that actually passed the House of Delegates unanimously. It passed 100-0, and it did not pass the state Senate, but we'll be back next session. And what that does is it would create a very small unit of government called the Just Transition Office, and then it would bring together an advisory committee to write a just transition plan for the communities that are the most hardest hit. And the goal is to find ways to attract as many federal resources and as many private foundation resources into the communities that need it most in order to diversify their local economies and create jobs. And if we as a state know what we want in terms of a just transition, and then we could work with the federal government.
West Virginia is kind of at the center of a national policy discussion around climate change. And our Senator Manchin is, right now, he's the ranking member, which means he's the highest Democrat ranking member of the Senate and Energy Natural Resources Committee. So any kind of climate legislation, Senator Manchin is going to be in a key leadership and influential position in terms of any policy at the federal level. So that's kind of exciting and also an opportunity, we think, to make sure that West Virginians' interests are definitely prioritized or thought of as the nation, considers climate change legislation.
While climate change is known for being highly political, there are other non-political solutions that communities and individuals can do to help. Actually, the largest greenhouse gas source in the United States is transportation, not electricity.
You don't see as many electric vehicles in West Virginia as you do in other states, but we're going to see a lot more electric vehicles in West Virginia over the coming years. But we need to have a place to charge them. Otherwise, you can't use them on long distances. So there needs to be a commitment made and investments made to install publicly accessible chargers all over the state of West Virginia. And I think we're going to start to see that over the next few years also. And so chargers can just use the same electricity that's on the grid right now, or they could be tied to renewables, in which case you'd be powering vehicles with zero emission energy.
Perhaps one way to help with the planet can start with the soil.
We have wonderfully valuable forested lands in West Virginia that can act as carbon sinks. They can suck that carbon into the air. So we have a lot of opportunity in terms of how we manage those forested lands. We have an opportunity to reclaim degraded lands from coal mining. We've got a lot of coal mining lands that need to be reclaimed. We can reclaim those in a way that help to mitigate climate change.
Given our changes in climate, there is no reason why West Virginia could not be the farm-to-table food basket for the Mid-Atlantic area. We should be disaggregating our food systems, training, out of work citizens to grow food on a local scale. We should feed West Virginians first, and then we can redistribute that food to a regional economy by leveraging warmer and wetter conditions.
But everyday citizens don't have to wait for things to change. They can help in little ways, like starting conversations to educate others, remembering to turn off the lights to conserve electricity, and recycling to reduce pollution. An easy way to start recycling is to commit to one medium. Recycle all the cardboard boxes in the house or all the paper, and then add things to recycle later once you get the hang of it.
The impacts of climate change are likely less severe here than in other parts of the country. But because we have unhealthy communities and we have highly vulnerable people, we are likely going to be impacted disproportionately more related to climate change. So our vulnerable communities are going to be more vulnerable. If we talk about climate change, and if we think about what we can do to protect West Virginians and what we can do to create opportunities by accepting climate change, I think we have a really real opportunity here in West Virginia. And it's my hope that we can do that because, my children are native West Virginians, and my family and I chose to move here because this place is amazing and we all know it. So let's do what we can.